Hello, welcome to the fourth video in the Cybis Porcelain series. In this episode, we will continue to examine the changes the studio made in the mid-1950s to transform the firm into a unique porcelain manufacturer as opposed to another pottery company mass-producing decorative wares. A little-known fact, one which the studio rarely disclosed, was that it utilized the works of other artists to design new sculptures being sold under the Cybis name. All pieces were marked Cybis and were sold as Cybis Studio Introductions. As a rule, recognition of an individual artist was not made in connection with the designs he or she created for Cybis. Therefore, many people wrongly attribute all items sold by the studio as having been designed by either Boleslaw or Marja Cybis. Pieces released years after the deaths of Boleslaw and Marja are often described in error as having been made by them. It wasn't until the mid-1960s that the studio did acknowledge that new introductions were being created by the artists of Cybis. It was, however, those early artists and design innovations that transformed the Cybis studio into the greatest porcelain manufacturer of the 20th century, making it the premier porcelain art studio in the United States. In the studio's earliest days, as Boleslaw continued to develop his newly formed company, commercial molds of various subject content were purchased, allowing the studio to quickly cast, decorate, and introduce a new line of products that could be mass-produced. This approach was intended to be a temporary fix. Even before the Cybis studio was fully launched, works by artists other than Boleslaw and Marja had been introduced with no recognition given to the artists responsible for the designs. To date, the only published recognition for a work done by another artist, released in the 1950s, was a crucifix the studio attributed to Henri-Georges Rouault. Rouault, a French artist born in 1871, was a devout Christian. He produced numerous paintings of crucifixion scenes, which are considered to be the significant portion of his work. It's no coincidence the one sculpture produced by the Cybis studio attributed to Rouault was a crucifix. This raises a question of why the Cybis studio selected the work of an artist from France. That answer may lie in Boleslaw's European background. Since Boleslaw was an accomplished artist for many years in Europe, having moved in circles where he would have become acquainted with others sharing his passion, he had probably known Rouault for many years. Whether Rouault sculpted the crucifix as a commissioned piece, or whether the studio may have designed the piece from Rouault's work is unknown today, but it was published as the Rouault crucifix. It was a notable departure from the common molds used to produce the other religious items being sold at the time by Cybis. This may have been an effort to show the studio was capable of producing items other than the standard molded pieces people recognized. The Rouault crucifix was not in the Cybis line for long. Its modern styling may not have sold well. If the studio was using Rouault's design by an agreement with stipulations, that agreement well may have ended with Boleslaw's death in 1957 and Rouault's death the following year in 1958. While Rouault's crucifix was the first item Cybis released in which they openly credited another artist, it was not, in fact, the first item designed by another artist. It is probable that honor falls to a man named Harry Berger. As the studio moved to introduce new styles, colors, and designs to the market, the works of other artists were incorporated. From the 1953 lawsuit Corday filed against a trade union, we know Boleslaw's health had prevented him from performing his duties at Corday. Court documents reference Harry Greenberg, a co-owner of Corday, as having assumed Boleslaw's role in the legal matters while Cybis was convalescing. With the issues he faced, it is unlikely Cybis was able to do the design work required to consistently introduce new pieces needed, and Marja's style limited her from producing the content necessary to move the studio forward. Either before Cybis Studio was incorporated, or during the time Corday was still being produced in tandem with the new Cybis line, the first piece from Harry Berger was put into production. The oddity of this is, it was first released as a Corday item with the incised Corday signature stamp. A large Madonna, holding the child Jesus, was introduced with the typical Corday adornments of roses and lace. This sculpture was short-lived under the Corday name and was later recycled as a Cybis introduction. The Cybis design was originally released as a dressed-down version from the Corday piece. It is documented as being released as a Cybis introduction in 1957 titled House of Gold Madonna. Because no records have come to light as of yet that indicate exact dates of introduction or production as a Corday offering, the best date that can be attributed to the Berger Madonna is 1952 to 1953. This piece was made in various colorways and redesigned at least twice, allowing it to remain in the studio's line as a non-limited, open edition item until the mid-1960s. It was, in fact, the early variety of sculptures and colorways offered that allowed the studio to get maximum use out of every design. They offered sculptures in bisque white, glazed white, color with a matte finish, color with a glazed finish known as stained glass, and finishes primarily in brown tones termed sepia. But perhaps the rarest of all was a finish with 24-karat gold accents termed old coin gold. While the Berger Madonna proved to be quite successful for the studio, it would not be Mr. Berger's only contribution. As a freelance artist, when the White House commissioned Cybis to produce a chess set to be given to the Soviet Union in 1972 as a gift of state, the studio called on Berger, who created the set. Also in 1972, the studio would release a new introduction for the Portraits in Porcelain collection that was another of Berger's creations. The Chinese goddess Kuan Yin was a limited edition of 350 sculptures. She was the only Berger design produced by Cybis not given as a gift of state. Mr. Berger's final contribution was the ballet couple Florimond and Aurora. President and Mrs. Nixon gave Aurora to the Bolshoi Ballet while in Moscow, and President and Mrs. Carter would use 12 pairs of the ballet couple to decorate tables for their first official state dinner at the White House, which was given for Venezuelan President and Mrs. Carlo Perez in 1977. Berger's Madonna design, reinterpreted as the House of Gold Madonna, would be given to Pope John Paul in 1978. In the mid-1950s, Cybis would also utilize the freelance work of an up-and-coming artist named Lassa Spanky. Attributed to Mr. Spanky, the iconic Madonna with Bird was first released by the studio in 1956 and was offered as an open edition, remaining in production for more than 40 years until the studio closed. Other Spanky creations would be purchased by Cybis as open editions like Wendy, Thumbelina, and Peter Pan as freelance designs before the studio hired Spanky as chief designer in 1960. During the 6 years he spent with the studio, some 90 pieces were released that are known to have been created by Lassa. Spanky sculptures released as limited editions, like Beatrice and Moses the Great Lawgiver, defined the Cybis look and drove sales to new records. After Spanky left Cybis and formed his own company, his success was equal to that of Cybis, and many collectors bought items from both studios. Collectors often told Spanky, "Your work looks like Cybis," to which Laszlo would often reply, "I think Cybis looks like a Spanky." This was for good reason, as his prolific artistic designs fueled the Cybis studio during the first half of the 1960s and were immensely popular with collectors. But of most importance, however, it must be noted that during the mid-1950s, when these first pieces by other artists were being utilized, that Marilyn Kosak Geraldton was proving her own artistic skills and demonstrating leadership within the studio. She had been the Cybis' protege, having been with them since their work on the murals in the Polish pavilion of the 1939 World's Fair. Bolesław's continued health issues coupled with uncontrolled depression led him to take his own life on Memorial Day in 1957. It was that same year Marilyn's work, The Turtle Doves of Peace, was released by the studio as their first limited edition offering. The devastating loss of Bolesław weighed heavily on Marja over the next year, and she too committed suicide on Flag Day in June of 1958. Having no children, the studio was left to Marilyn, who had invested 20 years with the business. Her previous years spent with the studio brought wisdom and knowledge. That, coupled with her creative insights and passion for beauty, would drive the Cybis studio to unimaginable success. It was under Under her leadership and careful guidance, the studio would move into its golden age from 1960 through the mid-1970s. Cybis continued to transform itself into a porcelain art studio, introducing numerous higher-priced limited editions while continuing to offer smaller open editions. The introductions during this time moved almost entirely to a matte finish in soft tones that would become the Cybis Studio's signature look for all future releases. The commercial molds were retired and glazed finishes were removed from the studio's line. Cybis was now positioned with amazingly talented artists and a new owner with the vision to drive the studio onto new heights, creating museum-quality pieces sought by royalty, dignitaries, and collectors the world over. Thank you for joining me to learn more about Cybis Porcelains. I hope you've enjoyed this video and will watch the others in the series. Please subscribe to this channel for notifications as new videos are added. For further information about Cybis Porcelains and the studio, visit the Cybis Archive at cybisarchive.com, where you can find specific information on individual sculptures and much, much more. The archive is the only in-depth resource available online and a must-visit site for anyone seeking more knowledge about Cybis. Thanks again for watching.